They laughed when 11-year-old Zara Mae Whitfield started collecting broken hand pumps from the abandoned barns of Calloway County, Kentucky. They really did. Full belly, head thrown back laughter. The kind that echoes across a dry county road and sticks to a little girl's back like burrs on denim. It was the summer of 2019 and Zara was barely 5 feet tall, all knees and elbows, with sun-freckled cheeks and a pair of her daddy's old work gloves that swallowed her hands whole. She would ride her rusted bicycle down those cracked asphalt roads, a bungee cord strapped across the handlebars, and she'd knock on the doors of farms that hadn't seen a family in decades, places where the porches sagged and the wind whispered through broken window panes, and she'd ask for one thing: the hand pumps. The old, rusted, forgotten hand pumps that stood like iron skeletons beside dried-up wells and crumbling cisterns. Mr. Henderson from the next property over saw her dragging a pump head across his gravel driveway one Tuesday afternoon, the cast iron scraping against stone, leaving a trail of orange dust. He stood on his porch, coffee in hand, and called out to her daddy, "Jed, your girl's gone feral. She's stealing scrap metal now." He laughed so hard his coffee sloshed. Zara didn't look up. She just kept pulling. Her arms shook. The pump was heavier than she was, but she didn't stop because Zara had seen something in those broken pumps that nobody else could see. Not yet. She saw water. She saw survival. She saw a future where the lights went out, and the electric pumps went silent, and the crops didn't die. But nobody believed that. Not then. Zara Mae Whitfield was the youngest of 3, born to Jed and Clara Whitfield on a 40-acre homestead that had been in the family since 1923. The Whitfield farm sat at the bottom of a shallow valley in Calloway County, where the soil was rich and dark, but the water table had been dropping for 20 years. Jed was a proud man, a third-generation farmer who believed in modern ways. He had installed 3 electric submersible pumps across the property, one for the house, one for the cattle, one for the crops. They hummed day and night, pulling water from deep aquifers, spraying it through center pivot systems that arched over the corn like steel rainbows. Jed was proud of those pumps. He'd mortgaged the farm to pay for them. "Progress," he told his children at the dinner table. "That's what keeps us alive, not these old relics." He'd gesture toward the back of the barn where his grandfather's hand pump stood, rusted and unused, a monument to harder times. Zara would stare at that old pump while her daddy talked. She'd trace the flaking green paint with her finger, feel the cold iron, and wonder why something so solid had been abandoned. It was beautiful to her, the curve of the handle, the mechanical simplicity, the way it asked nothing of the world but human strength and gravity. Her grandmother, Nana Ruth, had passed the spring before. She was the one who used to tell Zara stories about the drought of 1952, when the electricity failed for 3 weeks and the crops nearly burned. "Your great-grandpa," Nana Ruth would say, rocking on the porch swing, her voice like wind through dry grass. "He kept us alive with that hand pump. While the neighbors' fields turned to dust, our tomatoes were still plump. Because he didn't trust just one way, he always had a backup. He always had the old way waiting." Those words nested in Zara's chest like a seed. She didn't understand them fully at first. But the summer she turned 11, the weather started to change. The winters were shorter, the summers were hotter, and the spring of 2019 brought a dryness that settled into the bones of Calloway County like a fever that wouldn't break. By May, the creeks were running low. By June, the ponds were shrinking into cracked mud plates. The corn was knee-high and thirsty, and Jed's electric pumps were running longer and harder than ever before. The electric bills started arriving with numbers that made Clara cry in the kitchen when she thought nobody was listening. Zara heard. She heard everything. And then she started noticing the hand pumps. not just her grandfather's. All of them. She saw them everywhere once she started looking. Leaning beside abandoned farmhouses, half buried in weeds along county roads, standing sentinel behind barns that had collapsed inward. Some had broken handles, some were missing their valves, some were so rusted that the iron flaked away like dead skin. But Zara saw past the decay. She saw the cylinders inside, the leather cups that could be replaced, the check valves that could be cleaned, the pipes that could be resealed. She saw potential. Her first collection was a disaster. She found a pump in the woods behind the old McCreary place, half sunk in mud. She spent 3 hours digging it out with a garden trowel and her bare hands. She cut her palm on a rusted bolt. She didn't care. She tied it to her bike with a length of rope and dragged it 2 miles home, the pump bouncing and clanging against the asphalt, leaving a trail of rust and mud. She arrived at sunset, covered in dirt, her bike chain broken, dragging 40 pounds of iron behind her like a trophy. Jed met her at the driveway. He didn't yell. He just looked at the pump, then at his daughter, and shook his head. "Zara, baby, that's scrap. That's junk. We got electric pumps that do the work of 10 men. What you gonna do with that rusted thing?" He said it gentle, but it cut her anyway, the way adults cut children without knowing. "Leave the old ways alone, sweetheart. They belong in the past." But Zara didn't leave them alone. She couldn't. Something in her chest had shifted, and she couldn't shift it back. That night, she sat on the porch with a flashlight and a tattered copy of Farm Mechanics from 1947 that she'd found in Nana Ruth's attic. She read about hand pumps until her eyes burned. She learned about lift cylinders and leather seals. She learned about the difference between shallow well pumps and deep well pumps. She learned that a simple hand pump, properly maintained, could pull water from 40 feet down without a single watt of electricity. She learned that before the rural electrification of the 1930s, these pumps were the backbone of American farming. Millions of them, on every homestead, in every county, and then they were forgotten, thrown away, replaced by the hum of motors and the convenience of switches. Zara started her collection in earnest the next week. She mapped the county in her mind. She talked to old farmers at the feed store. She learned which barns had been abandoned, which properties had been sold to developers who never developed, which families had left their pumps behind when they moved to town. She became a scavenger, a hunter of iron. The neighbors noticed. Of course they did. In a county where everyone knew everyone's business, an 11-year-old girl dragging home-rusted farm equipment was better than cable television. The Hendersons started a running joke at the diner. "Here comes the junkyard queen," they'd say when Zara rode past. "What you find today, Zara? A broken plow? A rusted wagon wheel? You building a museum of useless things?" The other farmers would laugh. Not cruelly, exactly, but not kindly either. The way people laugh at things they don't understand. The way they laugh to protect themselves from the possibility that a child might know something they don't. Zara's older brother, Tyler, was embarrassed. He was 15 and trying to be cool, trying to fit in with the boys who drove trucks and talked about girls and football. "Zara, stop," he'd hiss when she came home with another pump, her arms scratched, her face smeared with rust. "You're making us look stupid. Dad's already got pumps. We don't need your garbage." Zara would look at him with those steady green eyes, the ones she got from Nana Ruth, and she'd say, "You'll see, Tyler. One day you'll see." At school, it got worse. The kids called her Pump Girl. They'd leave drawings of rusted pumps on her desk. They'd ask if she was going to marry a hand pump when she grew up. They'd hold their noses when she walked by because she smelled like iron and grease and old barn wood. Zara didn't cry. Not at school. She waited until she got home, until she was alone in the barn with her collection, and then she'd let the tears come. But even then, she didn't stop. She couldn't. because every pump she found was a promise. Every broken valve was a challenge. Every rusted pipe was a piece of a puzzle she was determined to solve. By August, she had collected 17 hand pumps. They filled the back corner of the Whitfield barn like a graveyard of iron ghosts. Some were beyond repair. She stripped those for parts. Valves, handles, leather cups, connecting rods. Others were salvageable. She cleaned them with wire brushes and vinegar soaks. She replaced leather seals with pieces cut from old boots. She greased the joints with lard from the kitchen. She worked by flashlight in the evenings, after her homework was done, after the dinner dishes were washed. Her hands grew calloused. Her nails stayed black with grease no matter how hard she scrubbed. Clara would look at her daughter's hands and worry, but she didn't stop her. Something in Clara recognized the same stubbornness she'd seen in Nana Ruth, the same refusal to bend. Jed watched his daughter with growing concern. The electric bills were climbing higher. The drought was deepening. The corn was suffering. And every evening while Jed sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, calculating how long they could keep the pumps running, Zara was in the barn with her rusted treasures. "She's wasting her time," Jed told Clara one night. "She's living in a fantasy world. Those hand pumps can't touch what we need. They're toys. They're history. We're fighting for the farm with modern problems, and she's playing with antiques." Clara didn't answer. She just looked out the window toward the barn, where a thin light glowed from Zara's workshop, and she said, "Maybe history is exactly what we need, Jed. Maybe we forgot something." The drought didn't break. It deepened. By September, Calloway County was in official drought emergency. The creeks were dry stone beds. The ponds were cracked earth. The aquifers were dropping, and Jed's electric pumps were straining harder every day. They were pulling mud half the time. The flow was weak. The corn was wilting. The cattle were thirsty. And then, in the third week of September, the power went out. It wasn't a long outage, just 4 hours. A transformer blew on the county road during a heat wave that pushed temperatures to 103 degrees. But in those 4 hours, Jed's 3 electric pumps went silent. The sprinklers stopped. The troughs went dry. The crops baked under a sun that felt like it was trying to erase the earth. Jed stood in his field and watched his corn leaves curl inward, watched the soil crack like a broken mirror, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear, real fear. The kind that tells you your backup plan isn't a backup at all. Zara watched her father from the barn door. She didn't say anything. She just went back to her workbench, where pump number 12, a deep well model from the 1920s, was almost finished. She had rebuilt it from the ground up. New leather cup from an old saddle, new valve from a donor pump, new handle carved from hickory wood she'd found in the woods. She had been testing it on the old shallow well behind the barn, the one that hadn't been used in 30 years. It worked. It pulled water. Not a lot. Not fast. But it pulled water. The power came back. The electric pumps hummed to life. Jed breathed again. But Zara didn't stop working. She knew something now. She had seen her father's face in those 4 hours. She had seen the fear. And she knew the outage was a warning, not an accident. She started building her real project in October. She called it her chain pump, though she didn't tell anyone the name. She had found the design in a 1912 issue of Popular Mechanics that Nana Ruth had kept in a cedar chest. It was a simple machine, a continuous chain of small cups or discs lowered into a deep well, powered by a hand crank or a walking beam. As the chain moved, each cup lifted a small amount of water and deposited it at the top, where it flowed into a pipe or a trough. It wasn't fast, it wasn't fancy, but it didn't need electricity. It didn't need fuel. It needed only human effort and gravity. Zara took the best parts from her 17 pumps. She used the cast iron frame from a 1930s McDonald pump as the base. She used the cylinder and piston from a deep well air motor. She used the chain and cups from a ruined windmill pump she'd found in a ditch. She worked every evening, every weekend, every spare moment. She cut her fingers. She bruised her arms. She got grease in her hair that wouldn't wash out for days. But she built it. The frame was 6 feet tall. The chain was 20 feet long, disappearing down into the old well behind the barn. The crank handle was polished, hickory smooth as glass from her hands. At the top, she had fashioned a spout from copper pipe she had found at the scrapyard, and it arched over into a wooden trough that led to the main irrigation channel. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was either going to work or it was going to be the biggest failure an 11-year-old girl had ever built in Calloway County. She finished it on a Saturday in late November. The air was cold. The trees were bare. The drought was still holding, though winter was coming. Jed was in town trying to negotiate a loan extension at the bank. Clara was in the house, baking bread and worrying. Tyler was at a friend's house, avoiding the embarrassment of his sister's junkyard. Zara was alone with her machine. She stood in front of the chain pump, her breath misting in the cold air, and she placed both hands on the hickory handle. She had calculated the physics 100 times. The siphon effect, the displacement of the cups, the angle of the spout, the depth of the well. She had done the math in notebooks that were stained with oil and covered in sketches. But math wasn't the same as reality, and reality was what waited at the bottom of that handle. She pulled. The handle resisted. The chain was heavy, 20 feet of iron and water sitting at the bottom of the well. She pulled harder. Her arms shook. Her shoulders burned. She was 11 years old, and the pump was built for a grown man's strength. But Zara had been pulling rusted iron across county roads for 6 months. She had been rebuilding valves and tightening bolts and carrying cast iron that weighed more than she did. She was stronger than she looked. She pulled again and again. The chain groaned, the frame creaked, and then, with a sound like a sigh from the earth itself, the chain began to move, slowly at first, then faster, cup after cup rising from the darkness, each one carrying a swallow of water, spilling it into the copper spout at the top. Zara cranked. Her arms screamed, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop because water was flowing, real water, clear and cold and impossibly beautiful, pouring from the copper spout into the wooden trough, running down the channel toward the fields. She cranked for 10 minutes, then 15. Her hands blistered, her back ached, but the water kept coming, steady, relentless. A thin stream, yes, but a stream that asked nothing of the electric company. A stream that didn't care about transformers or power lines or drought-declared emergencies. A stream that came from the earth and returned to the earth, powered by nothing but the will of an 11-year-old girl and the physics of a 100-year-old design. Zara let go of the handle and stepped back. The chain stopped. The water slowed to a trickle, then stopped. She was breathing hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. But she was smiling. She was crying and smiling at the same time, tears freezing on her cheeks in the November air. Because she had done it. She had taken their laughter and their mockery and their junkyard queen jokes, and she had turned them into water. Living water. She didn't tell anyone that day. She was too tired, too raw. She went inside, ate dinner in silence, and fell asleep before her head hit the pillow. But she dreamed of water, of endless, flowing water, of fields that stayed green when everything else turned brown. The drought got worse. That winter brought no snow, no rain. The soil was dust by February. Jed's electric pumps were pulling nothing but air half the time. The aquifer had dropped below the intake level of 2 of the 3 pumps. Jed had to pay a drilling company to come out and lower the 3rd pump, a cost that emptied the savings account and put the farm deeper in debt. The bank was calling. The neighbors were selling. The Hendersons were talking about moving to Tennessee, and then, in March, the power went out again. This time it wasn't 4 hours, it was 3 days. An ice storm hit Calloway County with a fury that hadn't been seen in 40 years. Trees fell, lines snapped, transformers exploded in showers of blue sparks. The county was dark, cold, frozen, and silent. Jed stood in his kitchen, staring at the dead light switches, listening to the silence where his pumps should have been humming. The cattle were lowing in the barn, desperate for water. The seedlings in the greenhouse were wilting. The farm was dying, and he had no way to stop it. He had put everything into electric pumps, everything into the modern way, and the modern way had abandoned him. He walked out to the barn, not knowing what he was looking for. Maybe just to be alone with his failure. Maybe to find something, anything that could help. He pushed open the barn door and he stopped. Because he heard something. A sound he hadn't heard in decades. The rhythmic creak of iron, the splash of water, the steady, patient sound of a pump working. He walked around the corner and he saw his daughter. Zara was there, in the cold, in the dark, her breath misting, her hands wrapped around a hickory handle that was moving in steady circles. The chain pump was working. Water was flowing from the copper spout into the trough, running down the channel toward the cattle barn. Zara's arms were shaking. Her face was red with effort. But she was cranking. Water was flowing, and the cattle were drinking. Jed didn't move. He just stood there, watching his 11-year-old daughter do what his $10,000 electric pumps could not. She was pulling water from 40 feet below the frozen earth, without electricity, without fuel, without anything but her own strength and a machine built from scrap and memory. He thought of Nana Ruth. He thought of his grandfather. He thought of all the old ways he had dismissed, all the wisdom he had thrown away in favor of progress. And he felt something break in his chest, not his heart. Something harder, something that had been locked for years. Pride, shame, wonder, all mixed together. Zara saw him. She didn't stop cranking. She just looked at her father with those green eyes, and she said, "Nana Ruth told me, Daddy. She told me the old ways don't die. They just wait." Jed walked to the pump. He put his big farmer's hands on the handle beside his daughter's small ones, and he pulled. Together, father and daughter, they cranked that chain pump until the troughs were full, until the cattle were watered, until the greenhouse seedlings had their drink. Jed's arms burned. He was out of shape for this kind of work. But he didn't stop, because for the first time in years he felt like he was farming, really farming, not managing machines, not paying bills, farming, touching the earth, working with his hands, surviving by his own strength. Word spread. In Calloway County, news travels faster than electricity. By the second day of the outage, neighbors were showing up at the Whitfield farm, not to laugh, not to mock, to see, to believe. They stood in the barn and watched the chain pump work, watched the water flow, watched an 11-year-old girl and her father keep a farm alive while the modern world sat frozen in the dark. Mr. Henderson came on the third day. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, his breath misting, watching the water pour from the copper spout. Then he looked at Zara, and he looked at the pump, and he said, "I got 3 hand pumps in my back field. Been there since my daddy's time. You think you could show me how to fix 'em?" Zara smiled. It wasn't a victorious smile. It wasn't an "I told you so" smile. It was the smile of a girl who had always known that water was more important than pride. "Yes, sir," she said. "I can show you." The power came back on the 4th day. But something had changed in Calloway County. Something fundamental. The farmers had seen what a child could do with forgotten iron and stubborn hope. They had seen water flow when the lights went out. And they started looking at their own barns, their own backfields, their own rusted hand pumps with different eyes. Zara became the teacher. At 11 years old, she became the county's expert on hand pump restoration. She showed Mr. Henderson how to replace leather cups. She showed the bakers how to clean check valves. She showed old Mrs. Gable how to grease the joints on her grandfather's pump so it would turn smooth as butter. She started a workshop in the Whitfield barn every Saturday where farmers brought their broken pumps and left with working machines. She called it the water circle. Nobody laughed. By spring, 17 farms in Calloway County had working hand pumps. By summer, 43. Zara's chain pump had been replicated by a blacksmith in Murray, Kentucky, who built 5 more for neighboring counties. The design was simple enough that a child could operate it, strong enough that it could pull water from deep wells, and reliable enough that it didn't care about power outages or drought declarations or failing transformers. The drought broke in July, not with a flood, but with a steady, soaking rain that lasted 3 days. The aquifers began to refill. Jed's electric pumps started working again, but he didn't rely on them alone anymore. He had learned his lesson. The Whitfield farm now had redundancy, the modern electric system for normal times and Zara's chain pump for the times when normal failed. Jed had painted the pump a deep forest green, and he had mounted a brass plate on the frame that read Zara's Promise. Est. 2019. The corn that year wasn't the best the Whitfield farm had ever produced. The drought had taken its toll, but it survived. It made it through. And when the harvest came, Jed stood in his field and looked at the green pump standing beside the barn, and he knew exactly why the crops were still standing. It wasn't the electric pumps that had saved them in the critical weeks. It was his daughter's hands, his daughter's vision, his daughter's refusal to let the old ways die. Zara kept collecting. Even after the drought, even after the laughter stopped, she kept riding her bike down those county roads, looking for abandoned pumps. Because she knew that somewhere out there, in a barn or a field or a ditch, there was another piece of iron waiting to be reborn, another well waiting to be woken, another farm waiting to be saved, and she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop, because water was life, and the old ways were wisdom, and she was only 11 years old with a whole county left to teach. The last time anyone laughed at Zara Mae Whitfield was a Tuesday in August. A new family had moved to the county, a young couple from Louisville with a fancy tractor and a subscription to every farming app on the market. They saw Zara at the feed store, her hands black with grease, her bike loaded with pump parts, and the husband smirked to his wife. "Look at that kid playing with scrap metal. Some people never grow up." Mr. Henderson was standing nearby. He set down his coffee. He walked over to the young man, and he said very quietly, "Son, that girl saved my farm. She saved my cattle. She saved this county's water when the lights went out. You might want to show some respect before you open your mouth about things you don't understand." The young man turned red. He apologized. He left, and Zara, who had heard every word, just kept loading her bike. She didn't need the apology. She didn't need the defense. She had what she had always wanted. She had water. She had purpose. She had a county full of farmers who no longer laughed, because they had seen what one determined child could do with a handful of rust, a book of old diagrams, and a belief that the past wasn't dead. It was just waiting, waiting for someone patient enough, strong enough, stubborn enough to bring it back to life. And so the chain pump turned, and the water flowed, and the crops grew. And in Calloway County, Kentucky, they still tell the story of the little girl who collected broken hand pumps, not as a joke, not as a curiosity, but as a reminder that when the world goes dark, when the machines fail, when the drought comes and the laughter rings hollow, there is always another way. There is always the old way. There is always a child with dirty hands and a clear heart, ready to turn the handle, ready to pull the water, ready to prove that the strongest thing on any farm isn't the machine. It's the will of the person who refuses to let it die. They laughed when she started, but when the well never ran dry, they understood. They finally understood.